So, greetings everyone. Can you hear me? It's okay, good. So it's early evening in Sofia, Bulgaria, and I was thinking that in this new world of ours, maybe we should think of new ways to greet each other, not connected to time, because for some it may be evening, so for some it may be afternoon, for another one it might be morning. Maybe we should wish each other a good place. So this type of new greeting, a good place to you all. What we're going to do today, I wish I could see you better or know you better, but maybe we'll have some chance in the question and answer period. The idea of this course is that Kristeva will present to you her most recent book, her most recent work, which is on Dostoevsky. She actually published two books on him, a shorter one, which has been translated already into English, and a much longer one, which is still available only in French. But she will tell you more about this when she meets you. And what I'll try to do is, so to say, begin things from the beginning and try to follow the development, the genealogy of some of her major concepts. I'm going to talk, so there will be no pictures, no slideshows, no things like this. Hopefully it's not too difficult or too boring, but just to by way of trying to make things easier, I will just let me know whether it works. I will simply put a list of no, for some reason it isn't. I'm trying to put this list of just names and titles and but it's not appearing in the chat.
In the chat? That's strange. You should be able to.
It's not. Let me. So if it's only one word, it appears. Okay, this is probably the problem is that it's too long. What can we do? I'll put it in pieces. Okay. No, it's
yeah.
Yep. So these are only names, titles, some terms, some historical events, which are given in the order in which they might appear in my talk. And I hope this helps. Can you see them now?
Yep, they're all there.
Okay. So there we go. I promised in my syllabus, I think, that we will begin with the semiotic and the quorum and why we have two terms and things like this. But actually, I think we will get to this only at the end of today's talk. Because before we speak about them, how they came about and what happened to them with the unfolding of Kristeva's work, we will have to speak about two other important terms, signifiance or signifiance. If we translate it, if you pronounce it in English, I'll tell you why we chose this term, not translating it, but rather simply taking it from the French, and semanalysis, with the first one persisting in the entirety of Kristeva's work, while the second one was later abandoned by her. But most of all, today, we're going to speak about changing artistic, intellectual, and political contexts. Beginning with the exceptionally productive decade of the 1960s in France, but not only in France. So it was a very, very interesting decade. And this is where we begin. Kristeva arrived in Paris from Sofia, from then communist Bulgaria. In December 1965, perhaps you know the story, with $5 in her pocket and on a scholarship that she would begin to receive a month later. So she practically had nothing, and it's a sort of fairy tale story what happened at the airport and how things finally moved on. Although pretty young, she was born in 1941, so she was about 24 at this point. She was already the author of quite a few publications in Bulgarian, including a short but solid book on tendencies in contemporary West European literature. The book would appear in her absence, so Kristeva would never go back. So it came in 1965 after she left. In 1966, actually. On her arrival, Kristeva had her own ideas as to whom she wanted to meet and what topics to tackle, but she was also helped in getting her bearings by another recent Bulgarian expat. I don't know whether you've heard his name. This is literary scholar, theoretician, author of a great number of books in French, again, Tsvetan Todorov. 6 months later, Kristeva was on her way to become part of major intellectual trends in France. I will not go into the biographical aspects of this story. You can find it in Alice Jourdain's beautiful book, At the Risk of Thinking. You will find the full title in the chat, as well as in French, in Kristeva's conversations with Samuel Doc, Je me voyage. It's a fantastic book. It's for those of you who read French, it's again in the chat. Looking in retrospect, we might try to summarize in the following way the tasks that Kristeva, in her passion for thinking, and it was really a passion for thinking, and she had it and she has it until this very day. So the task that she faced as a young woman arriving in Paris from a communist country. First, the tasks evolving out of her experience in a communist country. Simply put, these tasks amounted to the question, how do we fight dogma and repression? Intellectually, of course. And secondly, these were tasks connected to what has been called the French philosophical moment of the 1960s. According to Alain Badiou, for example, this period in French intellectual history is the third greatest one in philosophy, especially after classical Greek philosophy and German idealism. So it was really an amazing time. But it was also a time of political turmoil in Paris in the 1960s. Actually, not only in Paris, not only in France, a lot of things happened during this time in many places in the world. Once again, simply put, these tasks, which were emanated from her French experience, could be formulated as: how do we dismantle ideology in the sense of false consciousness, in the sense of what Marx would call inverted forms? We can talk about this more later. And stagnation. So dogma and repression on the one hand, and ideology and stagnation on the other. Dogma and repression are easy to see and dangerous to oppose. Ideology and stagnation are hard to perceive and even harder to resist. Of course, any ideology can cross the line and make itself visible by trying to become dogma. We have seen a lot of this lately. The overlapping of these two perspectives was crucial to the formation of Kristeva's early concepts and for the direction of her thinking. They both foregrounded the problem of change. Julia Kristeva is a thinker of process and change. The conceptual apparatus she developed throughout the years and the areas in which she has applied it have systematically been concerned with detecting, challenging, and fighting repression and stagnation. And she would do it on the level of the individual, but she would always also think on the level of society. Before going into some detail, I would like to emphasize the fecundity of this meeting of perspectives. Kristeva did not play the exotic card. So I'm this communist girl from Bulgaria, this type of thing. But she did not simply adapt either. She did not forget, on the other hand, and perhaps was never allowed to forget that she was a foreigner. Moreover, in her book, Strangers to Ourselves, which is in the chat, you'll find the title, but also elsewhere in interviews, again and again, she conceptualized foreignness as the foundation of universality, but also as an heuristic position, a position that allows a broader, more nuanced, more complex point of view. From the beginning, Kristeva played the two perspectives against each other and produced a critical distance to each, which resulted in her unique combination of passionate involvement and detachment, of zeal and intellectual sobriety. And so there were the questions and priorities pertaining to the situation Kristeva left behind. These questions included the East European experience of revolutions, metamorphosing, transforming, turning into dictatorships, and also the conviction that literature and the arts, and especially the artistic avant-garde, could be an antidote to this deadly transformation. It should also be noted that the years prior to Kristeva's arrival were quite hopeful. The death of Stalin, and here I realized that I did not put Stalin's name in the chat. I hope you know who he was. This was the Soviet Union dictatorial leader who was also leading during the Second World War, but who became more and more paranoid as time went by. I mean, this was a horrible, cruel time from many respects. But his death was followed by a decade or so of relative liberalization of the communist regimes. And the young Kristeva benefited from the intellectual flourishing which this liberalization allowed, and which would stagnate again after the suppression of the so-called Prague Spring in 1968. So again, speaking of the 1960s, it was also a time of great political upheaval, especially in the then Czechoslovakia. You can read more about this, but more or less what happened under the slogan for socialism with a human face. There was an attempt to soften the communist regime in Czechoslovakia, and this was suppressed by the invasion of the Soviet Union and other East European countries. It was more or less bloodless, but yeah, it was repressed totally. The point I would like to emphasize here is that in the face of ideological repression, a repression which was underpinned by scientific and theoretical claims, and I'm opening a little bracket here because the regimes in Eastern Europe claimed that they rest on science. So it was the science, this science was called historical materialism, and it was claimed that this science is the solid ground on which the future can be planned and foreseen, and so on and so forth. We cannot go into the details, but this was the ideology. It was based on science, and this science was supposed to be, you know, shouldn't be contested. It couldn't be, there couldn't be debate, or there couldn't be any arguing about this. In fact, there was, but and a lot, but with grave risks, and for those who would try to do this. But the result was that you have this idea that there is the science, and then there are, of course, many people who challenge this, and this challenge needed special strategies, because, as I said, this would be dangerous otherwise. So specific theoretical approaches, currents of thoughts emerged that proved effective in dismantling dogma in the long run. It took time, but it worked. The ensuing conflicts and struggles gave rise to in fact, a very vibrant academic scene. And here I'll quote Kristeva, which says in this French book, Chemin Voyage, autobiographical conversations with Samuel Dock. This is what she says about education, the educational and intellectual scene in Bulgaria. She says there was the solidity, I'm quoting, the solidity of school and university education, which across the totalitarian structure, and in spite of it, with all its flaws, cultivated a sense of effort, endurance, solidarity, and communal interest, while also valorizing the role of culture, initiative, and creativity. End of quote. A standard of scholarship was thus achieved, which made the life of apparatchiks of the nomenclatura difficult and ultimately disempowered them. The decisive factor in this process consisted in the elaboration of modes of thinking, theoretical tools, and stances that would be resilient to discursive control, and demonstrated their superiority to dogma. So she had this schooling in opposing dogma and finding the tools to fight dogma. A number of figures emerge in this context whose sheer quantity of encyclopedic knowledge was stunning, because they had to be different from the commissars, from the official proponents who claimed they were the science. So, and if you wanted to oppose them, you had to be able to oppose them. And by way of an example of such figures, I will refer again to Kristeva herself and to her character Dan in her novel The Samurai. And you have the samurai in the chat. Dan is based on the concrete figure of Tsvetan Stoyanov, not to be confused with Tsvetan Todorov, who was Kristeva's boyfriend before she left for France. She has referred multiple times to Stoyanov, who, among other things, is the author of a remarkable book on Dostoevsky. So there is also this in Kristeva's youth. She describes in The Samurai what she calls Dan's cultural gluttony. So he's a glutton for culture, but this was in fact typical for Stoyanov's generation. He was very notable, significant, remarkable, but he was not the only one. Dan, so the protagonist of the Samurai, is described by Kristeva, and I quote, knew practically every language and had read all the important works ever written in English, German, French, Russian, Spanish, and Italian. From the dim, distant past up to the present, he was a glutton for culture and had absorbed all the great writers, philosophers, and poets. Like some representative of the age of enlightenment strayed into an obscure country and another age, he bestowed his erudition on the ignoramuses around him in the form of skeptical parables. So this is the end of the quote about this Dan. This phenomenon of cultural gluttony goes far beyond the ideas of interdisciplinarity. It evokes utopias of the totality of knowledge and languages. Condemned to isolation by the communist regime, the friends and university colleagues whom Kristeva left behind assumed the stance which might be described, I described it in some places, vertical catastrophism. So you cannot go anywhere horizontally, so you build a vertical sort of world, an imaginary vertical world. As contemporary Bulgarian philosopher Boyan Manchev notes, the impossibility for Bulgarian thinkers to participate in the horizontal international debates sought resolution in an attempt to assume a meta position and integrate vertically the summa of theoretical thought, everything. Why I'm emphasizing this, we can see the mark of this utopia in Kristeva's early work from Semiotike, which appeared in 1969. So you see, 4 years after, it's not even 4, it was 3 years after her arrival, she already has published a remarkable book. It's an essay to Polylogue in 1977. So I'm talking about this period. And between these two books, they both consist of essays, and only some of them have been, these essays have been translated into English. Kristeva's early magnum opus was published, The Revolution in Poetic Language, only the first part of which has been translated in English. So I think in the chat I must have given both the English and the French title. The French title explains what the rest of the book is about. It's about modernist poets. In keeping with the claim that philosophy is the art of fabricating concepts, as Deleuze would later put it, Kristeva's early work is marked by a profusion of newly formed or refunctionalized terms, some of which acquired wide circulation, some of which she would continue to pursue, and some of which she would abandon. And we'll mention some of all these kinds. The point I want to make here is that Kristeva's staff terminological machinery addressing multiple literary and cultural issues through a multiplicity of schools and disciplines. While typical of the French, but also of the international intellectual scene at the time, this is nevertheless marked by excessiveness, whose precise lineage, I think, leads back to the intellectual scene she left behind. And so Kristeva is a thinker of change, but I should also add that literature always played a central part in Kristeva's thinking of change. The visual arts and music figure in important ways in her work, but by far it is literature which is at the center of her thought. And literature, of course, and language is the tool of literature. And as you see, she through Dostoevsky, she is back to this. Two major questions emerged from the task to think literature and change. First, how is language as the material aspect of literature transformed in literature and through literature into a mode and instrument of change? So if change is the task, then how does literature contribute to this? And second, how do we study this? How is this transformation through literature to be studied? So this is how in her earliest works, already in Semiotique, which, as I mentioned, is the book appeared in 1969, but many of the essays from the previous years, and in Revolution in Poetic Language, Kristeva elaborates the concepts of signifiance and semanalysis in order to confront this question, to answer these questions. So a note about the translation. So the term in French is signifiance. It has sometimes been rendered in a different way in English, but I think we should keep it this way. It is sufficiently clear in English. It conveys both the novelty of the term, but also its relatedness to signifying practice. To signify, that is signifying as process, which is going to concern Kristeva from these early works until the present. Now, an attempt for a quick definition of signifiance. It's the operation of the drives. So now we are already talking in psychoanalytic terms. It's the operation of the drives in, towards, in, and through language. That is to say, it is the process, she would insist, of constituting and dissolving meaning and the subject. So there is this process in which meaning is constantly produced and dissolved, and the same goes is true about the subject, which Kristeva would call subject in process. And of course, this is something which relates to any subject, but we can see it in operation in literature and in the arts. In one of Kristeva's lectures, you are going to hear she refers to a striking phrase which Freud uses. Freud says, a psychic revolution of matter. In formulations on the 2 principles of mental functioning, you must have this in the chat. So there is matter, and then suddenly there is a being which possesses a psyche, and Freud calls this a psychic revolution of matter. But again, revolution and later on revolt play a significant role in Kristeva's work. And whatever the changes that occur between her earlier emphasis on revolution and her later emphasis on revolt, I think they both could be referred to this leap described by Freud as psychic revolution of matter. So in many ways, Kristeva's work focuses on this mysterious leap, this gap, this transmutation and transformation. So this is a philosophical question, a question to which philosophy in the course of millennia has provided various answers, but it's also a question which today we are facing rather literally in having to decide at what point AI might be considered sentient. I will not go into this. I just want to emphasize that Kristeva's work is, from a certain point of view, entirely concerned with this question of how to describe the emergence of sentience in humans. There is a mystery there, a gap, a leap, a psychic revolution. And now, what about semanalysis? In Kristeva's early work, the term semanalysis is used to describe the theoretical method for approaching the process of signifiance. So signifiance is the process of making and unmaking the subject and meaning. And semanalysis is our method to study this. And the goal of semanalysis, she says in her preface to Desire in Language, you have the book in the chat, is to describe the signifying phenomenon or signifying, I'm quoting, to describe the signifying phenomenon or signifying phenomena while analyzing, criticizing, and dissolving phenomenon, meaning, and signifier. End of quote. So both terms evolve out of Kristeva's interest in the linguistics of Émile Benveniste, a very important figure, very interesting. She knew him, she wrote about him, but even at this early stage, she combines the linguistic perspective with psychoanalysis. So from the very beginning of her French career, we can see this happening. In her later writing, the concepts themselves are subjected to modification and developments, and practically semanalysis, which appears in the subtitle of Semiotique, it practically vanishes at the end of the 1970s. It is replaced, one might say, by a different approach, and it has been widely discussed as she discusses it herself in this way. It has been discussed as Kristeva's turn from linguistics to psychoanalysis. And this turn is succeeded or accompanied by a turn from revolution to revolt. We may speak about this next time, this shift from revolution to revolt, how to understand the one, how to understand the other. But in any case, it presupposes a sort of modification in the nexus of art and change, and yet it is there. So it's always this. Art and literature, they're about change, they're about rebirth, they're about our capacity to transform and not stagnate. And also, I believe there is a third turn which is visible in Kristeva's study of Proust. Maybe I forgot to, I hope you know this great French author. I think I forgot to put his name in the chat. So also the study of Colette, again, a French writer, Kristeva dedicated to her a book in her series on the female genius. But in both cases, they are novelists. They write novels, Proust and Colette. And I think this tendency is now further continued in her books on Dostoevsky, of which I will talk to you. I think this turn just mentioned it here. Maybe we can talk about this next term if you're still interested. I think this turn conceives what she has called the flood of language, apropos of Dostoevsky, makes room, this latest development makes room for addressing the contemporary digitalized hybridization of the literary. Maybe she won't be happy to hear this, but this is what I think. I think it allows us to discuss virtuality and various contemporary phenomena connected to new technologies. But whether we reach the point of discussing this or not, some further things we have to say before that, still concerning the early Kristeva. And here is the question why the avant-garde is so important to her. So we need to emphasize the pivotal importance of modernism and the avant-garde in Kristeva's work. Kristeva's interest in the avant-garde is connected to her interest in the transformative power of literature. The belief in these powers was especially vigorous with the Russian avant-garde, with futurism and poets like Mayakovsky and Khlebnikov, who preceded and were contemporaneous with the Bolshevik Revolution. They believed, figures like this, they believed that a new art, new poetry, and perhaps a new language, as is in the case of Khlebnikov's radical experiments with language, she thought that we need a totally new language. So they would believe that all this would form a necessary part of revolution and social renovation. However, with the consolidation of the Soviet state in the late 1920s, such beliefs and the artists who were still alive and shared them, Khlebnikov was not, but others were, not for long. So they were swiftly and mercilessly crushed. Modernism and the avant-garde were declared incompatible with the interests of the proletariat, and they were repressed. When Eastern European countries, including Kristeva's native Bulgaria, became part of the Soviet bloc after the Second World War, the publication of modernist authors, be they from East or West, was put under a ban. It was always contested, it was constantly contested, but we cannot go into this story. We just need to emphasize the paradox. The prohibition of modernism, in fact, reinforced ideas of modernism's revolutionary potential in Eastern Europe, I mean, a potential against the revolution that had betrayed both itself and its radical artistic proponents. With East European communist regimes so obviously not fulfilling their promises, the repressed avant-garde turned into a synonym of what went wrong from the very beginning, and into a promise for the possibility of setting things right. So this explains the extreme importance that the avant-garde continued to have in Eastern Europe, although under a ban. So prohibiting it made it more important and more effective and more interesting to everybody. The avant-garde was accompanied, and in many ways it inspired the theoretical developments related to Russian formalism, the Prague linguistic circle, and other tendencies indebted to phenomenology on the one hand and linguistics on the other. And here goes an important name, Roman Jacobson or Jakobson, who played a very important role in the inception and the international spread of these ideas, who coined the term structuralism in order to name them, and who emphasized the connection of structuralism to avant-garde practices. He was actually part of these artistic circles himself, produced, had artistic production and so on and so on. Fourth, Kristeva foregrounds this connection in her essay, The Ethics of Linguistics, which you can find in Design Language, where she brings together Jakobson, Mayakovsky, and Chlebnikov, while elaborating her thesis, which is the same one that animates Revolution in Poetic Language, that the stakes of poetry are that, and I quote, language and thus sociability are defined by boundaries admitting of upheaval, dissolution, and transformation. So upheaval, dissolution, transformation. I'd like to repeat this. I did, as I just did. Because these phenomena always concerned Kristeva, both with their destructive, she never forgets this, and their renovating aspects, and she would always trace them to what Freud termed psycho-revolution of matter. In a way, to be rebels is the human birthmark. And at some point, Kristeva would rephrase a famous quote by Camus. Again, I hope you know about Albert Camus. I forgot to put his name in the notes. She says, I rebel, therefore we are going to be. So the rebellion that takes place in each of us is the basis for our common future. Like avant-garde practices, structuralism had its share of trouble in the communist countries. So did the work of Mikhail Bakhtin, the ban on which was finally lifted at the beginning of the 1960s. While perceived as opposed to Russian formalism and by extension to structuralism, especially in the Eastern European context, Bakhtin's position is defined by Kristeva in an essay which is in semiotic. It's not, so far as I know, it hasn't been translated in English. But I quote, as one of the movement's most remarkable accomplishments, as well as one of the most powerful attempts to transcend its limitations. So she sees him as both belonging and transcending structuralism. And Bakhtin, of course, is the author of a very, very important book on Dostoevsky. So what Kristeva did in her early work was bring together Russian formalism and Bakhtin in a more comprehensive approach. but there are differences. We cannot go into all of them. It should be stressed that Kristeva's interest in the avant-garde initially focused on poetry, and structuralism was more involved there, while her study of Bakhtin took her to the study of the novel. So she will tell you more about this and her encounters with Dostoevsky, but there is no doubt that Bakhtin's analysis of Dostoevsky's polyphony contributed to the elaboration of her early concept. So Russian formalism, Bakhtin with Dostoevsky, and the fascination with the utopian extremism of the avant-garde were the point of departure for Kristeva's understanding of literature as a transformative force. She also had the awareness that the avant-garde's artistic and philosophical utopia had been thwarted in Russia and Eastern Europe. Her investment in the social and political efficacy of literature was hence both ardent and skeptical. So she always kept her analytical distance and was mindful of pitfalls, limitations, and inescapable disillusionments, if not, in fact, and she will also take this into consideration, the suicidal, destructive, and self-destructive lures, risks of the subjecting process, and which we will discuss also in connection with Dostoevsky. Paris gave Kristeva the chance to turn openly to the avant-garde literature and its theoretical implications, something which she could have done only at the price of excruciating strategizing in communist Bulgaria. Yet with the 1960s being what they were, Paris was more than a zone of comfort for artistic and academic freedom. In an atmosphere of political turmoil, other major intellectual developments reinforced the blend of poetic and theoretical radicalism that subtended Kristeva's philosophy of literature. And here, a note on literary theory, because this concerns Kristeva's transition from linguistics to psychoanalysis. In a comparatively late text entitled Thinking About Literary Thought, which incorporates passages from Kristeva's earlier writing on avant-garde poetry, but not really earlier than this text itself. It's especially the book, The Sense and Nonsense of Revolt. You have it in the chat. Kristeva traces the genealogy of literary theory, which plays an important role in the formation of her concepts. And here are the stages she outlines. First, there are the processes that begin with the metamorphosis of philosophy at the end of the 19th century. So this is the first important moment via the pivotal work of Husserl and Saussure, the names in your chat, but she also adds Jenslow as a linguist closer to phenomenology. Those processes constitute literary theory and literary structuralism as an investigation of form as thought. So form as thought, form itself is thought. This is a very good way to try to describe what's going on in this encounter between avant-garde art and structuralism. Russian formalism, Bakhtin's work, structuralism, and semiotics participate in this trend, which, as already noted, is informed by the avant-garde's utopia of poetry as a material force in social and even cosmic transformation. And for recent discussion of these processes, you can see Galin Tihanov's book, The Birth and Death of Literary Theory. And also we have a special issue, my colleagues, some of my colleagues and I, a special issue of differences on the, it's in your chat, on the undead in literary theory. I really like this title, so that's the undead in literary theory. But secondly, so firstly, there is a joining of avant-garde and literary theory via philosophy and linguistics. To this, Kristeva, however, adds a second perspective that brings avant-garde writing and literary theory into another fusion. The second fusion is accomplished by psychoanalysis and Freud. And so far as Kristeva is concerned, this is something that came from her experience in France. So this is already, we are finally in France. The second perspective concerns, I quote here, changes in how the, I quote Kristeva, changes in how the imaginary is perceived, a change contemporaneous with the transformation of philosophy and aesthetics. So these are parallel processes, but they concern the imagination. The first change then is the one that welds philosophy and linguistics in structuralism, but it is simultaneous with and contemporaneous, she says, again, I'm quoting, with unprecedented readjustment of the imaginary experience in modernity. So, end of quote. This new regime of the imaginary amounts, again, I'm quoting, to a meeting of literature and the impossible. It appears as a rival to the inner experience, while at the same time trying to change social structures by modifying the relationship between the speaking being and meaning, inasmuch as this relationship deeply codifies the social contract. I was quoting again, so I'll repeat the quote. This meeting of literature and the impossible is a rival. So it contests the inner experience, while at the same time trying to change social structure by modifying the relationship between the speaking being and meaning, inasmuch as this relationship deeply codifies the social contract. So from the innermost processes to modifying the social contract, this is what interests her, and this is what she finds in this meeting of literature and psychoanalysis. And this is, in short, the impact of the Freudian revolution. So while structuralism is the study of form as thought, the Freudian revolution allows for uncovering literature as thought of the impossible, or perhaps literature, and I quote, as a thought, a in the sense of lack of something missing, which Kristeva addresses through the writing of French surrealists. And I'm quoting, there is a thought at the boundary of that which is thinkable, an experience of language liberated from the shackles of judgmental conscience, which gives rise, gives access to this thought and gives evidence of its existence. So surrealism more concretely, but this type of literary experience gives evidence of the existence of this boundary. It is perhaps a matter of another world of thought, she says, that modifies the real world. The end of quote. So, the role of the French avant-garde. In the social and intellectual turmoil of the 1960s, Paris immediately enhanced the thrust for coming to terms with modernism, which was part of Kristeva's pre-Parisian motivation. Kristeva divides the French avant-garde in 3 stages. She explores the first one in the French edition of the Revolution in Poetic Language, because we don't get this in the English translation, but also in her later writing through the figures of Mallarmé, Lautréamont, and Rimbaud. The second stage is Surrealism, Breton and Aragon, which is the focus of the sense and nonsense of revolt. And the third stage of French avant-garde, she points out, is the era of Tel Quel, this journal, very important journal where major intellectuals like Derrida or Kristeva's husband Philippe Soulers and Kristeva herself, but many, many others, I don't want to make it too heavy, contributed. Tel Quel thus appears to Kristeva as the latest reincarnation of literature's confrontation with the impossible and of the unprecedented changes in imaginary experience. In fact, the incredible intellectual hub that the Tel Quel was in the 1960s when Kristeva joined it, not only presents a crossing of the two developments Kristeva discusses in thinking about literature, thinking about literary thought. So structuralism as the study of form as thought and psychoanalysis as uncovering literature as a thought. It also comprises, one might say, a higher degree of lucidity. She emphasizes this. We cannot go too much of this into this, but Kristeva describes this lucidity as literature faced with a classical and ultimately classicist philosophical plan. I really love this because classicism is this great period, especially in French literature, where all literature was based on a philosophy of literature, on its sort of views of what literature should be, philosophical views what literature should be, something which is sometimes called prescriptive aesthetics. But she says this is the same situation with the French avant-garde in the 60s, the Tel Quel period. This philosophical plan refers to the theoretical self-awareness to which we might add, she contributed, of the Tel Quel literary production. Hence, while the first two stages of the avant-garde provoke theoretical reflections that could render them comprehensible, structuralism explains the early stages of the avant-garde. The third stage is intrinsically and self-consciously philosophical. It knowingly blends its artistic madness, its risky destabilization of meaning and the subject with a philosophical plan. Later on, Kristeva will claim that her shift from linguistic to psychoanalysis was prompted by the desire to understand better what avant-garde poets were doing. Yet, as we already pointed out, the linguistic approach was again a project born of the desire to understand the avant-garde. So, just by way of an example, when Jacobson and Claude Lévi-Strauss enter with a sort of manifesto of structuralism, the French scene, they do it with a text on Charles Baudelaire. Who is, of course, the father of poetic modernism. Now, a few more minutes. Many of Kristeva's early texts follow the structuralist interest in modernist poetry, as well as the structuralist sensitivity to the work of sheer sound. Her insistence in these explorations, which will ultimately take her on a different path, is on problematizing the methodological standing of the Saussurean sign. So the Saussure's understanding of the sign, I suggest you go and read about this if you don't know what I'm talking about. In fact, her very first publication in Tel Quel, a year after her arrival in Paris, purports to demonstrate how Saussure's own work cannot be reduced to the concept of the sign, which is attributed to him. This is a huge discussion. I couldn't go into this now. The critic of the matrix of the sign underlies her reading of Bakhtin, whom she, by the way, she introduces to the West. It should be noted that in Bulgaria, before she left for France, Kristeva was closely connected to anti-structuralist, Bakhtin-oriented circles. Bulgaria being probably the first country outside of the Soviet Union where Bakhtin became popular. Now, I'll skip a little because we're running out of time, but for Kristeva, the understanding of the avant-garde and modernism would be impossible without considering productivity and consequently without dismantling the static and close character of the Saussurian sign. In her early essays, this involves turning to the phonic and visual materiality pestering the sign. So there is sheer sound. That is how the signs look on the page when they are written. So she also turns to translinguistic ingredients, be they gesture. So she writes an essay on gesture, or paragrammatic, which is again her text on Saussure. So all these things we find in poetry which are not exactly grammatical, not obey the rules of grammar or syntax. So all sorts of unsettling verticality, which are co-present with the linear unfurling of signification, and so on and so forth. What she's interested, she would call it in one of these early essays, engendering the formula. So she's interested in how meaning is produced and how the sign is produced. So she summons in this work lots of schools, perspectives, and sciences in order to capture the thing we already introduced, the signifiance. What's important to stress is that it's, from the start, it's translinguistic in its operations. So it exceeds language. It's not confined to language. It's not reducible to the string of words. Like mathematics, signifiance engenders formulas, which may or may not apply to social reality. So this is the sort of thing that results from her reading of her early reading of avant-garde poets. The accumulation of heterogeneous perspectives, which is characteristic of semiotique, will continue in Revolution in Poetic Language. Yet already in semiotique, there is the assertion that the production and the transformation of meaning is the place in semiotic, I'm quoting semiotic theoretization, where the science of psychoanalysis intervenes in order to produce conceptualization capable of grasping the figurability in language across the figure. Out of this crossing of linguistic and psychoanalysis, Kristeva major concepts will emerge. Especially the semiotic as opposed to the symbolic. The semiotic and the symbolic are conceived as two dimensions of signifiance, the translinguistic process producing meaning and the subject. One is never without the other, although to a different degree, depending on the type of discourse. The symbolic is the realm of syntax, logic, and the law. The semiotic accounts for the archaic, and I quote, this archaic pressure, which is pre-symbolic and anterior to the constitution of signs and syntax and speech, and which bears the trace of the intense relation of the child to its mother. So here we enter into another of Kristeva's great topics: mother, maternity, it's a concept which plays an important role precisely in her thinking of literary and artistic production. But just to round up, to wind up this part, the semiotic manifests itself as rhythm, ecolalia, gesture, coloratura, abstract pattern, music, dance, in short as ordering irreducible to meaning. Its job is to shake, traverse, shatter, and in all possible ways annoy the smooth work of the symbolic, which, being logically and chronologically posterior to it, and in fact supported by it, can never quite get rid of it. The semiotic thus unfurls abstract sensorial articulations preceding signification. It encompasses, and again I quote, functions and energy discharges that connect and orient the body to the mother. And we'll stop here, importantly, because we cannot really talk about the semiotic and the chora without also talking about the mother, which we'll do next time.